On the 18th of February 1858, a young girl named Bernadette Suberus knelt beside a small grotto near the town of Lourdes in southwestern France. She was 14 years old, poor, and largely forgotten by the world around her. Yet in the days and weeks that followed, Bernadette would experience 18 visions that would ultimately transform her into one of the most medically documented cases of the miraculous in human history. Today, we're exploring the extraordinary story of Saint Bernadette and the body that modern science has struggled to explain. Bernadette's life began in hardship and obscurity. Born in 1844 to a miller's family, she grew up in poverty so severe that her parents couldn't always afford to feed their children adequately. At the time of her visions, she was sickly and frail, suffering from chronic asthma and digestive ailments that plagued her constantly. She had little formal education and spoke only the local Occitan dialect, not the refined French spoken by educated society. By every measure of the world, Bernadette was unremarkable, invisible, and insignificant. She was exactly the kind of person whom nobody would ever expect to encounter the divine. On that cold winter day in February, Bernadette was gathering firewood near the Gave River when she suddenly heard a sound like wind, though the air was perfectly still. Looking around, she saw a brilliant white light emanating from a small cave in the limestone rock. Within that light stood a figure of a woman, shimmering and radiant, dressed in white and gold. The apparition was silent at first, but gradually communicated with Bernadette through gesture, and eventually through words. The figure claimed to be the Immaculate Conception, and asked Bernadette to return to the grotto for 15 consecutive days. Word of Bernadette's visions spread through Lourdes like wildfire. At first, the local priest was skeptical, as any reasonable religious authority would be when faced with claims of divine apparition. The Church had learned through centuries of experience to be deeply cautious about such matters. However, Bernadette remained consistent in her testimony. She was questioned repeatedly, sometimes harshly, but her story never wavered. She spoke with a certainty and simplicity that seemed almost impossible to fake, especially for a young girl of her limited education and background. As crowds gathered at the grotto, something unprecedented began to happen. The spring that Bernadette had revealed during her visions started to flow with water that people claimed possessed extraordinary healing properties. Pilgrims who arrived at Lourdes began to experience inexplicable recoveries from serious illnesses and injuries. Word spread across Europe and beyond. And soon people were traveling from distant lands to visit the grotto and drink from its waters. The Catholic Church, initially hesitant, began to investigate these claims with the rigor of modern science. What happened next was remarkable in its thoroughness. The Church didn't simply accept testimonies at face value. Instead, they established a rigorous medical commission to investigate the healings occurring at Lourdes. Doctors would examine patients before and after their visits to the grotto, meticulously documenting their conditions, running tests, and gathering evidence. This medical investigation has continued uninterrupted for more than 160 years, making Lourdes one of the most scientifically scrutinized pilgrimage sites in the world. The medical evidence from Lourdes is staggering in its scope and detail. Over 70 million pilgrims have visited the grotto since Bernadette's visions. Of these, tens of thousands have claimed healing. Yet the Church's medical commission has been extraordinarily conservative, officially recognizing only 70 cases as genuine miracles. To be recognized as a genuine miracle at Lourdes, a healing must meet an exhausting set of criteria. The disease must have been serious, progressive, and incurable, according to contemporary medicine. The healing must be sudden, complete, and permanent. There must be no natural medical explanation possible. The patient must have already undergone serious medical treatment that failed. And there must be documentary evidence from qualified physicians at every stage of the process. But the focus of our story today is not on the pilgrims who came to Lourdes seeking healing. Instead, it's on Bernadette herself. After her visions ended, Bernadette lived a quiet, humble life. She became a nun, entering the convent at Nevers, far from Lourdes, seeking solitude and prayer. She deliberately distanced herself from the fame that her visions had brought, rejecting any notion that she herself possessed special powers or holiness. She was remarkably ordinary in her desires and her daily life. Yet what happened to her body after her death would become one of the most perplexing cases in the history of medicine and spirituality. Bernadette died on the 16th of April, 1879, at the age of 35, having spent most of her adult life in religious seclusion. Her body was buried in the convent cemetery at Nevers, as would be expected for a nun. 21 years later, her body was exhumed for an official investigation into the miraculous nature of her visions. What the investigators found was absolutely extraordinary. In a damp underground crypt, in conditions that would normally cause rapid decomposition, Bernadette's body remained almost completely intact. Her bones were strong and uncorroded. Her skin retained much of its suppleness. There was no significant decay, no corruption, and no odor of death that would normally accompany a body of such age. When her body was exhumed again in 1922, more than 40 years after her death, the preservation was even more remarkable. The nuns had placed her in a sealed oak coffin within a zinc casket, protecting her from the damp crypt environment. Yet even with these precautions, the absence of decomposition was medically extraordinary. Her organs and tissues showed virtually no deterioration. When doctors finally performed an autopsy years later, they were astounded to discover that her internal organs were largely preserved. There was no sign of disease or corruption that would normally have set in decades earlier. But the most astounding discovery came when her body was examined by medical experts in the presence of detailed records from her life. The woman, who had suffered from chronic asthma and digestive problems throughout her youth, showed no signs of these conditions in her remains. The organs that should have shown damage from her lifelong illnesses were intact and healthy. Her lungs, which had been weakened by asthma, showed no scarring or chronic disease. Her digestive system revealed no signs of the ailments that had plagued her throughout her life. Medical science had no explanation for this absence of disease and decay. Today, Bernadette's body remains on display in a glass reliquary in the convent chapel at Nevers, where pilgrims can visit and venerate her remains. She was canonized as a saint in 1933, officially recognized by the Catholic Church as a holy person worthy of veneration. However, the reason we're discussing her today isn't primarily because of the visions or the healings at Lourdes, though those are certainly remarkable in their own right. We're discussing her because her physical body itself presents a medical mystery that even modern science has difficulty explaining. The preservation of Bernadette's body is not entirely unique in religious history. There have been other cases of incorruptible bodies throughout the centuries, though such cases are extremely rare. Some have been explained by the specific chemical properties of the soil, the sealed environment of the casket, or other natural factors. Scientists have proposed various theories for Bernadette's preservation, including the antiseptic properties of certain minerals in the soil, the sterile environment created by the sealed caskets, or unusual environmental conditions in the crypt. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the remarkable state of preservation, combined with the absence of disease in her organs. Doctors and pathologists have examined the detailed medical records of Bernadette's life and compared them with the condition of her remains. The records clearly document her chronic illnesses in youth. Yet her internal organs show no evidence of the long-term damage that these conditions should have caused. This presents a puzzle that medical science has not fully resolved. How could a body that bore the marks of serious lifelong illness show no evidence of disease and deterioration decades after death? How could organs that suffered from chronic illness be preserved so completely and remain disease-free? One interesting aspect of the case is that Bernadette herself never claimed any personal power or holiness. She consistently directed all attention away from herself and toward the spiritual significance of her visions. She discouraged people from viewing her as special or miraculous. This humility is itself remarkable, given the extraordinary attention and fame that surrounded her. It suggests that whatever extraordinary quality her body possessed was not something she cultivated or sought out. It was, in the truest sense, a phenomenon beyond her control. While her incorruptibility is recognized as unusual and difficult to explain by natural means alone, the Church does not officially declare it miraculous in the same way it declares certain healings miraculous. The Church is cautious about making definitive claims about her body's preservation, acknowledging both the unusual nature of the evidence and the possibility of undiscovered natural explanations. This cautious approach reflects the Church's general methodology of requiring the highest standards of evidence before making any claims about the miraculous. Yet the fact remains that medical science has not produced a fully satisfactory naturalistic explanation for all aspects of Bernadette's preservation and the absence of disease in her organs. Various theories have been proposed and debated in medical literature, but none has achieved universal acceptance among pathologists and medical experts. The case continues to fascinate doctors and scientists who study the intersection of medicine, spirituality, and the unexplained phenomena of the human body. What makes Bernadette's case particularly compelling is the combination of multiple factors that cannot be easily explained away. There is the historical documentation of her lifelong illnesses. There is the detailed medical examination of her remains. There is the remarkable preservation of her body in conditions that should have resulted in normal decomposition. There is the absence of disease in organs that should have shown significant damage. And there is the complete absence of any adequate natural explanation that accounts for all these factors simultaneously. Bernadette's story reminds us that there remain mysteries in the world that challenge our current scientific understanding. She was not a person seeking fame or attention. She did not claim to possess miraculous powers. She was simply a young girl who experienced visions and then lived a quiet, humble religious life. Yet her body after death became a puzzle that medical science continues to contemplate. Whether we attribute this phenomenon to unknown natural causes or to something beyond the material world, it stands as testimony to the limits of current medical knowledge. The case of Saint Bernadette also highlights the importance of rigorous investigation and documentation when dealing with claims that challenge conventional understanding. The Church's approach to examining the healings at Lourdes and investigating Bernadette's incorruptibility demonstrates how scientific methodology can be applied even to matters of faith and spirituality. This careful approach has resulted in a body of medical evidence that is difficult to dismiss, even for skeptics. Today, Bernadette's remains rest in the convent at Nevers, where they have been preserved and protected for more than a century. Medical researchers continue to study the case, though access to the remains is limited and highly controlled. Some researchers have proposed new scientific theories about preservation mechanisms that might explain aspects of the phenomenon. Others maintain that the case remains fundamentally unexplained by current scientific knowledge. The debate continues in medical and scientific circles, with no consensus emerging about the true cause of Bernadette's incorruptibility. What we can say with certainty is that Bernadette was a real historical person whose life and body have been extensively documented. The visions she experienced changed the spiritual landscape of an entire region. The healings that have occurred at Lourdes have been studied more rigorously than probably any other claimed miraculous phenomena in history. And the state of her body after death presents questions that remain unanswered by modern medical science. Whether you interpret these facts through a lens of faith or skepticism, they represent a genuine mystery that deserves serious consideration and continued investigation. The legacy of Bernadette extends far beyond the grotto at Lourdes or the convent at Nevers. Her story speaks to something fundamental in human experience, the desire to understand what lies beyond the boundaries of normal experience. It raises questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between body and spirit, and the limits of scientific explanation. In an age when we believe we have explained most of the mysteries of the natural world, the case of Saint Bernadette reminds us that genuine mysteries remain, awaiting explanation and understanding.